All right, thanks everyone. Welcome to the Open Grand Final of the Asian British Parliamentary Debating Championships 2023. I have the honor of being your chair for this debate. My name is Uday, and judging on the panel with me will be Asif, Charlie, Ernest, Isaac, Jordan, Kataru, Minami, and Pranav. In this grand final, we have, in opening government, UP Diliman A, in opening opposition, Ateneo de Manila University A. In closing government, Peking University A. And in closing opposition, the Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay. The motion for this round reads, this House regrets the emphasis on sacrificing when determining the moral value of actions. And without further ado, I would like to invite the Prime Minister to speak to that motion.
Hello? Testing? Hello? Can I be heard? All right, good, fantastic. To say that to die for one's country is the ultimate sacrifice is fundamentally an assertion of power. Opposition will lie to you in this debate when they say that people sacrifice themselves to die for others. This is incorrect. Sacrifice is manipulative. It is impossible to argue against because of the all-depleting nature of life, and for these reasons we argue at opening government, it has corrupted our ability to see evil and uncover evil in this world. What is the likely counterfactual in this debate that we will argue from opening government? Without the emphasis on sacrifice as defining the moral value of actions, we prefer a world where the moral determination of actions does not get hijacked by the ultimating and finalizing nature of sacrifice. Why is it finalizing? Why is it ultimating? Because life is the only thing that we have in this world, and the sacrifice of that life is suddenly used as an automatic metric in which we judge moral actions and the moral worth of individuals. Think martyrdom, think motherhood, think soldiers. The circumstances of all these actions and all these individuals in the way in which they sacrifice their time, their effort, and their lives for the sacrifice that they do inherent to the activities of these individuals are justified because of the voluntary self-inflicting nature of sacrifice. Our argument is that this is a discussion of how sacrifice's moral worth has played out throughout moral history or throughout human history, and we argue this has been done and weaponized in a fundamentally manipulative, in a weaponizing manner that allowed states to commit injustice and atrocity across the world. I have two arguments in this speech. Number one, I will discuss the centralizing nature of sacrifice, and number two, I will discuss the counterfactual. Number one, on the centralizing nature of sacrifice. Allow me first to do some impacting here. Pain is an incomprehensible and overwhelming feeling. It is alienating. It is dehumanizing because of the way in which it causes this visceral pain that no one else understands. Only an individual understands it. No one else can feel it, and the impossibility of human relationships makes it impossible for us to empathize and understand what that pain means. To the extent then that the pain on others is a consideration in this debate or is used as a metric on a utilitarian metric that pain on multiple individuals is a moral harm, we would argue it is fundamentally unjust to prioritize individualizing and centralizing sacrificed pain over others. So, my argument then is that this centralizing nature of sacrifice, or the emphasis on sacrifice, deferred and skewed our moral consideration for the pain of others in three fundamental ways throughout human history. Number one, because sacrifice in the way it has been weaponized has been bound to structures of power and privilege. Why is this the case? Soldiers were conscripted by larger nations who had the capacity to send more soldiers into other wars and continue to use propaganda to justify those wars and say that because because those soldiers were dying, even if they were conducting massive human atrocities across the world or collateral damage that was incalculable, it was the soldiers that we looked at for moral consideration. It was their medals that we brought back to the country. It was the families of these soldiers that we talked about and said that they were deserving our moral worth and consideration, and they were deserving of our empathy. And we argue that this sacrifice, media-wise, but also in terms of the discussion on the justification of war in general, made it harder and harder for us to try and consider the moral circumstances of why this war was justified, because it is skewed by sacrifice, because it is skewed by those soldiers that were dying, because it was so much easier to look at the fact that a soldier that is going out into the war zone, going to give up and go to the extent of giving up their own life, is something that is all ultimating over all anything else. Mother Teresa giving up her life in Calcutta when she tolerated inhumane child labor, or even when mothers are asked to sacrifice more and give up more of their time. These are ways in which, like the patriarchy, internal power structures continuously coerce individuals in people to continuously give up in ways in which they do not consent. Number one. Number two, because sacrifice emphasizes the voluntary nature of death here, rather than emphasizing the ways in which other people are subjugated because of sacrifice and by sacrifice. Think of the us versus them narrative that is created by Christian martyrs when they entered into the Philippines, when they argue that it is so easy for us to fight against individuals of color, individuals who were savages, individuals who were threatening a Christian social order of God, by saying that you need to try and change these nations. You needed to justify colonialism on the basis that people's lives were being sacrificed, that there are people that are saintly, that these people are morally visceral. They're more important than anyone else because of the way in which they gave up their life to meet their God in this way. But lastly, because sacrifice is the most approximate and visceral and fastest way in which we see the pain of others or see the pain of one individual person. So this death becomes more important than anyone else's death because it is easiest for states to utilize it as evidence. When all the evidence of other burial sites get systematically buried as a consequence of those atrocities, but it is only those coffins, only those particular sacrifices that are shown more and more over others. Closing. So my argument is that there are other ways in which war can have the bars to which they should be met to justify war or intervention. Humanitarian intervention can be justified in other ways outside of this. It does not depend on one sacrifice over others because of the fundamental way in which it's bound to that power. So, my argument then is that I think that it is far worse for you to argue war on that basis because of sacrifice. Second, on the counterfactual. So, the counterfactual rejects the need for undermining and believing that you should sacrifice for the case of others. The best case of opposition in this world is the Filipino priest that runs up to a grenade and holds it to their own to sacrifice themselves for protecting school children. But what does the glorification of sacrifice undermine? It undercuts the excess pain and sacrifice that otherwise individuals would not have made and are made to make as a consequence of uplifting themselves in the social ladder. So what does this mean? Inherent to this in sacrifice, when people are social justice warriors or people who are from social justice movements across the world, they are made to be pressured to deplete their time, effort, and ask for the exhaustion of their life for those that are in power or for those to counter systems of power. So it becomes easier for them to become a martyr, for them to get social progress. We argue that this is fundamentally immoral because of the way in which those individuals are made to exhaust themselves in ways that a lot of people would have otherwise not. And we prefer that death is bad. We prefer that life is good. We prefer that all these things are fundamental goods that people should seek. The way in which sacrifice changes that metric, it makes it a shortcut and a harder way for people to try and get that metric for themselves. So for these reasons, because we argue that the way in which sacrifice is played out throughout human history and the way in which it has been manipulated and weaponized in this particular manner to skew moral decision making, we argue for opening government.
Thank you to the Prime Minister for that speech. I'd now like to invite the Leader of the Opposition. Also, just a reminder to speakers, when you offer a POI, we have provided microphones for that.
check. Oh. Mic check. Is this good? Three, two, one. Let's go. Opening opposition does not deny the existence of social evil. We do not deny that quite often the concept of sacrifice has motivated individuals to take difficult life choices that often come at the expense of their health and their own security. However, what is missing from opening government is a discussion on what the specific emphasis of sacrifice does for these atrocities, such that in the counterfactual, when there is no emphasis, what happens to the people that go through the war? What happens to women that sacrifice their career and their individual identity in order to pursue motherhood under the structure of the patriarchy? What we are going to do is emphasize on sacrifice, the idea on heroism, the idea on trade-offs, the fact that it intersects and intervenes with other social norms such as capitalism, the patriarchy, values on family, and it is not just about the presence or the truth value of whether or not sacrifice should be constituted as a moral value, but it is about the emphasis and what that does for the other social norms it interacts with. For this grand final, Ateneo A will enter with the following things. The first thing we will enter with is the defense that the emphasis is a necessary tool for valuing human life, especially amidst the atrocities demonstrated in the Prime Minister's speech. The second thing we are going to do is have a little bit of a discussion in terms of what really is the reality in terms of sacrifice and the way it interacts with people. At the top of this speech, the first thing I want to engage with is the weighing that comes from the Prime Minister in terms of sacrifice and its visceral value, and in terms of how it is shown through, like, coffins, for example, and how they revere war veteran heroes on different parts of the media. The first thing they note is that we would suggest this is a utilitarian good. Often the nature of sacrifice and the difficult jobs it means that people take, like becoming a soldier, like becoming a mother, like becoming an overseas Filipino worker to protect for their family, often result in utilitarian things that we would suggest are moral goods. Other than the general fact that it means, for example, going to war ensures that you have state security, becoming an overseas Filipino worker or having an additional job means you get to serve your family and have an extension of your principle of love for your family, it often also allows people to occupy roles, duties, and responsibilities that other individuals would not take on either way. On opening government, while you de-emphasize sacrifice as a view for a moral good, because there is no value to it, there's no perception that it is a good thing, we are unsure as to whether or not people would occupy those positions of power. But second of all, to clarify, the opening government counterfactual implies that they don't want people, for example, to continue to become soldiers. They don't want people, for example, to occupy those positions of power. And therefore, they have to defend a world wherein the rate of people that opt into those roles decrease over time and often affect broader society. The second discussion I want to attack is how this is a necessary force in combating life's unforgivable circumstances. Let's clarify first and foremost what is symmetric in the debate and symmetric on government. On government, there are forces that drive humans to sacrifice through making difficult trade-offs. And there are three key ones we want to highlight in the debate. The first is forces of economic necessity. For example, underprivileged people or breadwinners of their families who continue to work more jobs in order to provide for their family, even if it comes at the expense of their own mental health. People like overseas Filipino workers who decide to go to Malaysia, to Dubai, to America, to earn more money for their family, even if it means becoming estranged from their children. Second, it is forces of emotion. The love that you have for family, significant others, friends, for example, that compels you to continue to do these things even without the existence of the emphasis. But third, it is abusive power structures, like women who sacrifice in the name of motherhood because that is what is expected from them from the patriarchy that exists on either side of the debate. Second, for example, poor men who are conscripted into the war to sacrifice for their nation. The thing I want to note in terms of this argument is that these are often inescapable conditions for human life. The patriarchy still exists, the war or conflict still exists, for example, and therefore there will still be forces enforced by the state, enforced by the patriarchy, enforced by broader society, that will push people into these conditions that force them to make difficult trade-offs and force them to sacrifice. But second of all, these are all significantly difficult to cope with, whether or
PY.
not you're in opposition or government, because first and foremost, there is physical stimuli and biological reactions to these things. Like motherhood is obviously painful, dying and getting hurt in a war is obviously painful, but also damning emotional trade-offs, like the feeling of regret that you experience as a mother when you watch other people who are single and childless and imagine what your life could have been. And therefore, what this means is that even if government over time says that because there is no emphasis on sacrifice, you will no longer feel bad, or for example, you no longer feel like something is missing, it means that on either side of the debate, they still continue to get hurt, and all the emotional and physical stimuli and negative impacts of going into the war, of having those wars highlight going to motherhood, still exist on either side of the debate. Before I discuss what changes and what is the true comparative, PY from closing.
You can see that a substantial number of women sacrifice due to patriarchy. Why is this narrative not reinforcing and exacerbating the patriarchy?
So the first thing I want to note is that there is not a clear margin on how much more women or less women continue to have birth and experience that pain on government or opposition. Insofar as we agree that at the very least there is some modicum of women that will still continue to give birth, could still continue to subscribe to motherhood, we at least give them that avenue to feel like they are respected, to feel like that choice is something that is worthwhile, especially insofar as a lot of these things are often irreversible and often inescapable. On government, individuals often still sacrifice for reasons beyond their control. This results in 3 negative impacts that engage with the way that people cope with those negative experiences. The first is that it decreases the nature of forgiveness for crimes of circumstance, which promotes broader empathy. So for example, the forgiveness people espouse for illegal immigrants because they understand that they are sacrificing for their family and perceive them as individuals that on net are doing something that is morally good. Second, it fails to offset the pain that comes as a result of these sacrifices. Your own family is less likely to make you feel, for example, loved as a result of your sacrifices. You yourself are less likely to feel like you are a good person as a result of the sacrifices you made. The honor that is given to veterans, for example, who develop PTSD as a result of their sacrifices is less likely to occur. But third, the perception of morality that is increased, the demand, for example, of structures that make the lives of these kinds of vulnerable people easier. The fact that maternity is given to mothers, the fact that a lot of benefits are given to soldiers, for example, these things are more likely to be clamored for, to be demanded, to exist. Insofar as there is a narrative that individuals who create sacrifice often are those that are attached to a moral good, and therefore we perceive those people as good in comparison to the debate on whether or not we should have those policies or have those welfare benefits becomes significantly more shaky on opening government and closing government. The emphasis is a mitigating circumstance against the depleting nature of life as demonstrated on opening government. And for all these reasons and more, vote OO.
Thank you to the Leader of the Opposition. I would now like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister.
Thus, make sure it stands up. All right. Empathy is impossible when sacrifice is unquantifiable. And that is the world that opposition constructs, where you constantly change the goalposts for women, constantly change the ability to appreciate minorities. And that is why if they want to try and win this debate on where minorities are better off, that is a world they lose. 4 things I will do. The first is the explanation for why sacrifice, if it is good, is better appreciated on Gov. Second, on women and why there are incentives to value them a lot more under Gov. Thirdly, I'll talk about why state construction and national identity and cults of personality are far better. And lastly, I'll talk about why sacrifice is impossible to quantify and why that is good. Firstly, why sacrifice is not good. Their claim is that sacrifice is good for many utilitarian reasons. Four things. Firstly, you would likely do it either way for the reasons that OG says it is. You likely still want money. You likely still want to care for your kids in a utilitarian way. The difference is not a world where you would never do it regardless, but the world that opposition defends as you centralize it so much to the extent that you are able to be co-opted by majority. Sure. That means that under their world, when it is so centralized, you are unable to scrutinize it, and therefore under their world, the way the majority is co-opted means that it is not women who are prioritized through maternity leave, because in many states that still does not exist, but instead, men in positions of powers, state leaders and state heroes, individuals you probably would not scrutinize in their alternative because they are the ones constantly constructing it. But second, the flip is the case. I agree with sacrifice regardless, but you valorize sacrifice on op without the ability to collectivize for pragmatic action, because you opt into it, you lean into it, you buy into it as a good thing. There are three reasons why you do not get change. Firstly, on an individual level, women do not feel it is necessary to request for greater political will, and therefore they feel less urgency to request for greater things. That means on their side, you're unable to construct a world where you're getting political change for individuals who are unprotected by workers' rights. But also, secondly, perceptually, people feel like you do not deserve it because they feel like your sacrifice is already something that is morally rewarded. That is something they do not need to help. But also, more crucially, empathy is impossible. Their experience of empathy or their experience of sacrifice is intrinsically different to my experience of sacrifice as compared to things that are consequential, as compared to things that are easier for you to quantify, because they are concrete in terms of lives and deaths that you save. They are concrete in terms of the individual intent that you declare and individual capacities you have. Their sacrifice, being value neutral and being very liquid, means that other individuals will not have the incentive to sure.
So, to be clear, how will people view sacrifice on your side such that it becomes quantifiable for all
It
of
is
your
not
thoughts?
morally good or not. It is now something that is irrelevant compared to things like consequences and intents, because those are things that we prioritize instead. That is the consequence that we have. The third thing I want to point out is there are incentives to appreciate socially utile behavior regardless because of great consequences. For example, minorities, for example, if minorities do want to help out within society, those are things we prioritize a lot more, as opposed to sacrifice, what the cost is to you. Unique differences of sacrifice is they look at the cost to you. What do you take away from yourself? The difference is we prioritize what you add to the world and what you give to other individuals. That's better, because regardless of how much you've done, you create a value judgment and a moral judgment of whether or not that's helpful to society as a whole. That is far better, because if what you prioritize is socially utile things, like prioritizing individuals who are minorities, it's a lot better. But also, secondly, we think it's good in terms of social construction. Secondly, their claim is that we wouldn't value women and people who offer their lives in the absence of this. Women are not valued on their world more because the system of sacrifice, as Luigi explains, is constructed out of privilege for three reasons. Firstly, minorities do not have the most to give, and therefore they are not the individuals you prioritize within this narrative. Second, such that their sacrifice is not as good as sacrifice of a military man. What we correct in the comparative is, regardless of your identity and regardless of your privilege, your ability to construct a possible consequence and a good consequence is far better and far more equal. Second, there is control over what sacrifices are good as ranked by the majority, and therefore, because it is so fluid, it's a lot easier for them to constantly change it, as opposed to consequences that I explain are more concrete. But thirdly, we explain that sacrifice, being unable to quantify, means that even if you do value women, women are not likely to speak out about it and therefore are not able to get that change. Why that means it's bad is because on their world, sacrifice is always viewed from the perspective of the giver. It is skewed because they often hold resentment towards the situation, even if it's dire, and often it's biased. When moral value and correctness is contingent on an individual's construction of reality, it becomes impossible to be impartial because you always look at the cost. That means that moral value, being separate from consequences, creates a division into what society actually constructs, because now it's going to always be from the perspective of an individual as opposed to the state. Why then is it bad in terms of state construction and the cult of personality and extension? 3 points of framing. First, national identity on GOP's world is often formed around the belief that sacrifice determines and outweighs any other metric because of national heroes. Sacrifice uniquely focuses on a singular trade-off for the majority, and that's why they create these valorizations. Second, sacrifice being valued to such a high degree means you place the most moral worth on state martyrs, sure.
if your alternative is that people value based on social utility or utilitarian metrics, that means if I'm not smart or strong, I have no value. If I'm a woman, I have no value.
That is a wrong read of utilitarianism. Utility is constructed not just on whether or not you're good or not, but often how you're able to better equalize these things. The consequences of equal capacities, obviously equality, are things that are morally and socially good. Secondly, we explained why the moral worth placed on state martyrs and heroes, independent of the ideology, controversy, or history, means we do not scrutinize them. But the third point of framing is that because sacrifice is so viscerally, emotionally defined, it's what pushes people to be politically invigorated to the point of fanaticism. This means that they, A, escape accountability and scrutiny when they are aware moral judgment is based not on mismanagement and failure, but the sheer movement of sacrifice they can portray as having given out. That's bad for future political stability. Secondly, national identities become deeply divisive, on their will and exclusive when they're tied to individuals. On the comparative, focusing on consequences means that maybe it's imperfect, but A, because it's concrete, you can find the pain that's been caused as a consequence of military intervention to be more valuable than a vague and constantly fluid version of sacrifice. But secondly, wars are better because you better scrutinize it if they really are necessary. You better scrutinize the moral value of something, and you are forced to make value judgments, scrutinizing not just state leaders, but the stability of a state that is far better, as opposed to the idea that, well, our forefathers have sacrificed so much and therefore we should construct it. You cannot create rallying cries of the far right or individuals who go back to history on other world, because now we look at whether or not these are good things. Yes, maybe we forget things like history, but consequences become less polarizing, and that's why states are far better. For those reasons, we win.
Thank you to the Deputy Prime Minister. I would now like to invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Hello, is this audible? Keeps falling. Before I start my speech, this speech is for everyone who's loved and supported me. Most importantly, it's for the debaters who feel, like I did at the start of my career, that it took years before anyone listened to you. Even though this sport is extremely cruel, there's a reason to keep debating, because it helps you grow and it helps make the world a better place. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The real lie in this debate is that sacrifice is the reason why the world is horrible. Power structures will always exist, right? Bea told you that people naturally already tend in themselves towards sacrifice far too much, especially when they need to. Needy people are disproportionately forced to sacrifice if they want to live. So the tipping point is not whether or not they will do it, it's whether or not society forgives them for it, or society glorifies them for it and helps them for it. Imagine the world in which sacrifice is not used to justify wars or used to oppress people. the powerful people will still find ways to oppress you and force you into sacrificial behavior. They will tell you things such as, might is right, right? The fact that you are simply inferior as a woman means that you should yield to a man in decision-making and simply child rear. People enslave people, not because you should be my slave, it's a good thing to do. It's simply through means such as violence and using their wealth to deny education to others and force them to be subjugated. What is the real delta in this debate, right? I don't care if they say that, we have removed one factor behind the oppression or that creates them, right? There's clearly no tipping point for this. What there is a tipping point for is three things. Firstly, it's that the least privileged will find fulfillment. And this is taking the best case of government in which sacrifice is created by the governed. Even if that is the case, the less privileged who are forced to sacrifice can say that I am a moral actor. My life had value and I'm a virtuous person because I did the sacrifice that was told to me because of whatever benefits they promised to me. That means that in the very worst case in which slavery, patriarchy always exists, at least the poor will still feel like they've lived fulfilled lives. The counterfactual is absolutely none. But the second thing is that this is a social norm that changes over time, right? There are two things I want to specify here. Firstly, they say that there will probably be a society where people judge completely morally. No, social norms always exist and usually pervade people's decision-making and don't allow them to adjudicate what is truly moral. Society will tell you again that, capitalism, it's all about meritocracy. You should be selfish. You should just climb the ladder and become as powerful as me if you want a cut of the table, right? It is natural for people to be very selfish in their decision-making, and so they will not trend towards what is morally best. They will already trend biologically for things like self-preservation to what is best for them. But the second thing that I want to note here is that since this is a social norm, what eventually happens is that the poor will weaponize it more. If it's true that the less privileged internalize the idea of morality more, then they will care about it more. And that creates two things. Firstly, they eventually reinterpret what sacrifice means to them and makes it better. Since morality is the weapon of the disprivileged and they have moral ascendancy and claim to it, that means that one, they will probably judge better and empathize more with others. That if other people are sacrificing, I should be less willing to hurt them, right? We are all just forced to sacrifice in this world and we should be kinder to one another. But secondly, it also creates that sympathy from those in power, right? Firstly, the bleeding heart white people who think they are giving development and aid to the less privileged with welfare, etc. Sure, they're super annoying, but at least even though they justify aid to the disprivileged because, I should sacrifice as well for even as a rich person if I want to be a good person, even though it is annoying how they justify it, it still results in better outcomes for the disprivileged because this is an all-encompassing norm, as Luigi said. So therefore, even the rich people will want to sacrifice. Once they already have wealth. But the second thing is that the poor people who force themselves to sacrifice will demand it for those in power. Sure, they don't have their own wealth and power right now, but it manifests in the votes that they have. They want to vote in a politician who also sacrifices because, one, I think that a moral person who will lead the country is someone who's capable of sacrifice, and therefore they don't just vote in someone who's popular, someone who's charismatic, or who promises greatness for the nation. It's someone who sacrifices and probably takes trade-off for them. But secondly, it's the fact that once you have sacrificed yourself, you want other people to sacrifice because if we are good people and another good person should be willing to sacrifice as well. What that means is that although the original narrative of sacrifice is created by the governed, the oppressed are able to use it as the only way to create reform. This is very important because it flips a lot of what happens in opening government. Absent this narrative, there is no means for the disprivileged and the less powerful to get accountability back from those who oppress them, right? It is simply ruling by force. It is where Machiavellian leadership and might is right is enough to subjugate the rest of the world, and no one has a point in the discussion. I'll take closing.
Presumably, at our side of the house, we also care about the consequences when you do help those people, right? These consequences directly determine whether you're moral or not. Why is that comparative?
That's not proven. I told you people naturally, biologically, and socially trend towards selfishness. This is something that OG didn't preempt, and you have to answer that in your speech if you care about that. The second thing I want to do is just take out anything remaining from opening government, right?
PY?
They say that collateral damage is simply justified based on sacrifice, right? The first thing I want to dispute is that the sacrifices that people are forced to make are usually most proximate to you. So yes, there's a general narrative for sacrifice, but there are also tiers to what kind of sacrifices you should make, right? And what that means is that you probably have a greater obligation to your family rather than your nation. Why? One, because you created that family. Two, because you are the only one who can help that family you chose to enter to them versus your nation, in which the politicians are seen as the guardians of that nation. What that means then is that people think twice before they are conscripted into the military, right? They join the military because they think that the family is the harm at the end of the day, right? And therefore, people trend towards being cautious and saving people that are more assured. But the second thing is that, again, I've watched all of this. Collateral damage still happens. War will still happens for more people, right? And people are forced to conscript based on you don't have a choice. We will not give you subsidies, or we will force you to conscript at the end of the day, right? What that means then is that there's no tipping point for the harm that is done. There is simply a tipping point for how much reform we can do to that harm in the future. The last thing I want to talk about is what's unresponded from Bea and why that's debate winning. They told you about how you create a more forgiving society because people are structurally forced to sacrifice already. If everyone can emphasize for the people who are sacrificing, who had to rob a convenience store to feed their dying child, who had to cross the border to seek opportunities for their children in the future, that is when crimes of circumstance have a lot more empathy, right? Imagine again their world, since they don't refuse to imagine, they just have a negative case, right? That is a world in which people are simply evaluated on the moral judgment of an action, and that is when it's most unfair to the most disprivileged, because actions are always coerced by the circumstances that people are pushed through anyway. We have a world that is far more forgiving and empathetic, but even if that doesn't happen, at least those who are forced to sacrifice feel themselves that they are good people and that their lives are worth living.
Thank you to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. I'd now like to invite Government Member.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Okay, before I start, just a few quick shout-outs. I really want to thank the Chinese debating community. This is the first time that we're making ABP finals. I especially want to thank the people that can't be here today. I want to thank Kiki for being on the advisor council. I want to thank Ivy. I want to thank Judy. These are the people that have coached me, debated with me, and they're really my inspiration and the reason why I stay in debating. And I really want to apologize for being an annoying kid to them. I also want to thank my partner, Ray, who is probably going to say he's going to retire after this tournament, but no one will believe him. Okay, finally, I guess just thank my parents, who constantly ask me why I'm not tapping high enough after every tournament. Okay. I think Luigi is correct. There is great evil in this world. But the worst crimes in the history of humanity are committed not out of evil, but out of arrogance. It is when the parent forces the child to toil and go to extracurricular courses without rest. It is when the abusive coach tells you to be grateful for what he has sacrificed for you. That's the extension from closing government. Two things in this speech. First, on framing. Second, why on their side, people are much more likely to intervene in the affairs of others and why that intervention is terrible. First, on framing. Three important things here. Firstly, morality and law, crucially, are separate spheres. That is to say, when coercive power exists, there is no need for morality. There are a couple of reasons for this. The first reason is conscription occurs symmetrically because the state has the coercive power to force you to go into the military, and the state has the violence to suppress you if you do not obey. Secondly, oppression of minority through legal structures occurs symmetrically because there's no economic incentive for wealthy individuals who have all the vote, who have hegemonic control over media, to give them more welfare when they can allocate that welfare towards things that they like better, towards their own budgets. Thirdly, the state crucially has the capacity for indoctrination, so it's not just through the venue of morality, it's also through the venue of how history is constructed, what's written in the textbooks, which is why this nationality, national identity formation thing from opening half is quite nonsense. What is morality then? Morality shapes our decisions, as O.O. rightly points out, in our daily lives, social interactions, and personal choices, because these spheres are not subjugated to the forces of state coercion. Also, because the family is most proximate, because your friends are most proximate, because you every day dine with them and have conversations with them, these are the people whose opinion and perception of you care about. These are the people who define morality that you view for yourself. Second piece of framing to point out is sacrifice happens on the margins, right? It's not just life versus death. So war is certainly not the most important impact in this round. One, it's unclear if more war has good or bad consequences overall for the world, as the opening deadlock has pointed out. So what is the more likely consequence? It is that on their side, you're talking about mothers sacrificing themselves to take care of their children, becoming housewives, and taking them to the best extracurricular classes. It is people choosing to be teachers being told that they're sacrificing themselves and therefore noble. It is people that donate to one particular organization or work for one particular charity being automatically shielded from accountability because they're told that they're noble and that they are moral. Third piece of framing, who are told that sacrifice is morally good? I would suggest it is unlikely that those that are most vulnerable are forced to sacrifice due to this narrative. We have given you 5 reasons for this. The first reason is our first piece of framing, which is to say those that are most vulnerable will be coerced either way through state infrastructures. Secondly, there is no capacity for those that are most vulnerable to act, so it is unlikely that people demand much from them on a pragmatic basis. Thirdly, people have basic empathy, right? O is quite uncharitable here, so it is likely that the majority of people recognize that those who live the worst and poorest lives should not be demanded to sacrifice even further. Fourthly, oftentimes, you as a poor people living in poverty do not care when self-preservation is a priority, when putting food on the table is a priority, rather than how moral you are to the general public, which is a very privileged and elitist consideration. Finally, I just point out, OO has a contradiction from LO to DLO, right? At LO, they say it is natural to want to sacrifice. At DLO, they say it's natural to not want to sacrifice and be selfish. They have to pick one characterization. No, thank you. Therefore, what is the likely counterfactual? It is those with privilege and power that are told that sacrifice makes you noble. It is those with privilege and power that are told that sacrifice itself automatically makes you a morally good person. There are 2 reasons why this is the most important context in the round. The first reason is opening government also has a conflicting characterization. At PM, they say the elite. At DPM, they say the elite is told to, the elite sacrifices, and therefore they're glorified. At PM, they say the minority is forced to sacrifice. So they also have to pick one characterization. Secondly, this characterization, no thank you, deals with op bench's best case. That is to say, in the best case, when those with privilege and power, the white privileged people, are told that sacrifice is noble, we're going to flip OO's case and prove to you why that is actively harmful. Now the extension. Why are privileged individuals, no thank you, likely to intervene in the affair of others in the name of sacrifice? There are 4 reasons for this. The first reason is, on their side, taking time off your own things, your own interests, and intervening in the affairs of others in an attempt to help them makes you feel moral and noble, because that's precisely what the narrative is on our side, on their side. It makes you feel like the savior. So first, it's intensely satisfying. Second, humans are social animals. They want the respect of others. They want to tell other people about this good thing they've done. Therefore, on their side, people have the automatic incentive, no thank you, to intervene in the affair of others, to help children, to help kids that they're teaching. Secondly, it often gives you a sense of moral superiority. So the fact that you're helping someone who needs to be helped means that they're vulnerable and you're superior. It reinforces your ego in that it proves you are strong and you are powerful. Thirdly, there's the expectation of reciprocity. So at the point where you helped your child a lot, you sacrificed a lot for your child, the moral narrative on their side is your child has to buy into that morality and therefore give you better conditions for the rest of your life. And you want that. Fourthly, meaning is constructed socially, as we've told you. So oftentimes you do care about how other people view you. You feel like it's empty if you're just helping yourself. The emptiness of being alone and catering to your selfish interests motivates people to care about other people, to help them in the name of sacrifice. No, thank you. Before I move on. Yeah.
There's no contradiction. People are naturally selfish, yet materially, the disprivileged are forced to do the painful action that is sacrifice. So we get social support for it, empathy, and fulfillment.
Okay, we'll deal with your best case either way. Why is intervention by privileged individuals likely to be bad? There are 2 crucial reasons for this. The first reason is it takes away from the autonomy of those that are least privileged, people that understand themselves and their own interests best, versus you who have no knowledge of their circumstances, who assume that they need the same things that you do, they desire the same things you do, when one, you're often born in different times, so you have a generational gap in your interests, but two, you are born in different environments, you occupy different positions of power and have very different interests. Note that this intervention is worse than inaction. On their side, you traumatize children who are told they're never good enough, who are sent to all sorts of classes without any ability to rest. You deny their ability to explore their lives however they want. Versus, on our side, maybe you don't create happiness, but there is a moral obligation to prevent harm rather than create happiness. There is a legal obligation to do the minimum for your kids, for your children. But on their side, that moral obligation often creates massive harms that children experience. Secondly, on their side, you're shielded from accountability because people don't emphasize the consequence of your actions, but the fact that you've sacrificed means you have to be moral. So if you're a really bad, abusive teacher, but you sacrificed all your time and energy to teach, then you're shielded from blame. Therefore, firstly, you have no incentive to do good as an individual, you only have the incentive to do what makes you feel best. Secondly, charities, churches, schools, all these institutions face much less accountability on their side. What did OO prove? On OO, the most vulnerable people, in the best case, feel a bit better. On CG, you prove massive harms inflicted on them, resulting from this decrease in accountability and this blind imposition of their own morality and their own beliefs on other people. For that reason, never been prouder to propose.
Thank you, government member. I invite opposition member.
Before I start my speech, I just want to take a minute to thank people. Firstly, thank my partner. I wouldn't have been debating for so long, or just being interested in this activity for so long without teaming up with her, or say staying in the activity for her. So many days crying, so many days just in absolute misery. I'm just glad we're here. I'm standing here because I'm standing on top of giants. Jaimal Lodha and Pushkar Mohile, you've been an inspiration to me. I'm just glad I was able to beat your record. It's been 10 years since India has been in the stage. India, the stage is yours. Go ahead and take it. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, and go. Unlike Rivaldo's jawline, opening up was not strong enough and sharp enough in impacting their case. I'm going to go ahead and do two things to your panel. I don't think human race would have existed without people caring about each other. I'm going to explain to you why the emphasis of sacrifice was the reason why human race existed. I don't even want to position my extension because if you buy this, we clearly win. The first thing I want to talk about is why would humans inherently prioritize their own self? They go ahead and tell you that, oh, they just do. I'm going to explain to you what exactly this looks like. The first thing I want to note is that humans have descended from animals, which means they operate on a pain and pleasure model when there is no moral value given. What do I mean by this? It means, but if you operate on a pain and pleasure model, you should go ahead and maximize your pleasure by having sex with people regardless of consent. But we don't do that because we value consent as a moral value or a moral good. That is what differentiates humans from dogs and animals. What do I mean by this? This means we think if there is no emphasis of this moral value, people would go ahead and do whatever they want to maximize their utility as such. We think people would resort to maximize their own utility at a point in time when you don't emphasize sacrifice. What does this look like? Parents, even when their food is scarce, they will go ahead and give their food to children because there's moral value attached to being a good parent, or there's absolute moral good. People are willing to go ahead and ration food and not eat whatever they want because even when they're hungry, they know that there's moral value or good in sacrificing. I'll not take you. There's moral value in this thing. thirdly, people are willing to go to war and protect their mankind, even if there's, like, CG wants to say there's reciprocity. I don't really see this reciprocity, but I'm going to go ahead and explain to you why that's not the case. What do we think this emphasis on moral value was important to form and sustain communities? We think the person who was able to hunt gave the food to other people, or the person who was strong was able to protect their own herd because they were able to go ahead and say have moral value. What then? I'm going to go ahead and do this. We think love and sacrifice are intertwined with each other, and it's incredibly important in this debate. Why is this true? I want you to note, panel, you don't sacrifice things in a vacuum, which means if I go ahead and say melt a bar of gold and then say, oh, I sacrifice my wealth, it means absolutely nothing. Which means sacrifice has this moral good only if it's spent on something or it's considered sacrifice as such. Which means there's some value attached to the sacrifice as such. What then is love and care without sacrifice as such? Love and care in isolation means absolutely nothing. Love is literally sacrifice, which is to say, giving up something of my own moral good. I love somebody, or I care about something, or I care about an idea or a passion or whatever. I go ahead and sacrifice something that is going to be inherent good to me immediately, and I do that as such. Giving up on something so someone else can use the benefits and utilize these benefits as such. This is why we think love and sacrifice was important. What then do we think are the immediate benefits of this? This is why you certainly not just care about, say, people who are your immediate surroundings because you love and care about them, but also over a period of time, the social norm they talk about go ahead and develops. Which is to say, you don't just care about your people or their norm or your people of people or group of tribe, but you necessarily have a social value and attribute developed to it. What then is this look like? How does narrative reinforce? I'll take you later. How does this narrative reinforce as value good? The first thing I want to note is that society go ahead and reinforces this to you. What do I mean by this? We sacrifice things for you, which means you necessarily should sacrifice things for you. Every single time when you're a small kid, they go ahead and tell you should share things with your kid. You share things with your brother and sister. You should care for your people. If somebody is going out, you should care for your own kind and whatnot. Which means this was pushed down to you. But then there are also other coercive narratives that go ahead and push this idea of sacrifice down to you. This looks like religion, right? You're taught as a kid that you need to go ahead and sacrifice because if you don't sacrifice, it's not good or there's no moral value attached to it. But then you also see other people in your tribe go ahead and sacrificing things as such. We think all of these things collectively come together means that you're able to actually buy into a normative or moral value of sacrifice as such. Before I go on and explain why this was important in forming communities and why this was the reason why people form communities.
Why does care for others or fulfillment necessitate privileging the pain of one person over others? Sacrifice crowds out solutions to repair quantifiable inequalities.
I don't think so. Why would people do things that they're immediately more proximate at a point in time when you don't emphasize on sacrifice? There are three structural reasons for this. One, people always want what is immediately good for them, which is to say you have dopamine rush, or say you want what is most optimal, what you want to get out of it. Which means you go ahead and buy, go ahead and say get food in the sense you want to use the food as such. The second thing is you have uncertainty of return, which is to say, I can get something reciprocity over a long period of time, but I don't go ahead and think about that, or I don't form a collective group or whatnot, because it's not important for me to get something later. This is what you call as hyperbolic decision making, where something that is shorter to you, it seems a lot more proximate and important, and something that is longer to you doesn't really look proximate or important, which means you don't go ahead and do these things. We think then what happens is in a world where sacrifice was not pushed down societal, and there is no value or net good or normative value that is taught to these kids as such, means that a world where people prioritize their own good and people are able to just do whatever they want and utility oriented world. This means when you collectively come together, you don't necessarily know how to care for them because you don't know what caring is. Because caring is literally sacrificing. You don't necessarily know what loving your tribe is because loving your tribe literally means you have to give up your own, say, human inherent good, which I've already proved to you. You don't collectively work together because there is uncertainty of what returns could come together. There is a hyperbolic decision making, which means you just want to go ahead and maximize whatever you can go ahead and do. What are the impacts of this? We think the impacts of it is threefold. We think this is why people collectively came together and we are okay, we can make something work. And because you care about the people, because it was taught down to you, coercively, uncoercively, whatever, it was pushed down your throat, which means you cared about the people. You were able to collectivize and you were able to say, the people who were strong were able to go protect your tribe, the people who were in the houses were able to make food or whatnot. Which means you were able to collectively club together and you had a comparative advantage over other animals. I.e., you were able to maximize learning, you were able to like you were able to like you were able to protect yourself. You were able to find things like farming and like say like develop as a community altogether. We think this is why you are able to like say prioritize the needs of collective good, because you are able to inherently sacrifice for something you care about and not just collectively sacrificing your own good. Here's the deal, panel. We think at a point in time when this attribute or emphasis is not given to these people, if at the point in time when society is not told to you, or these kids don't develop with the ability to say sacrifice a lot for others, they're not able to like they live in a world where they live in a world in Cup where they don't necessarily end up having the values. They revert back to their animalistic traits, and they're able to like just go ahead and do what they think is most important to them. I think that is when you're not able to collectivize together. We think societies form because of sacrificing. So proud to oppose.
Thank you, government member. Thank you, opposition member. I now invite government whip.
Hi everyone. Before I get started, I also want to thank a lot of people who helped me at the Chinese circuit. For instance, Judy, Kiki, and also our previous coach Sam for helping us along the way. Yeah. CG is the only house that gives you the more realistic depiction in terms of where this narrative is probably going to happen. It's not going to happen at the CEO's context, which all their case is based on the context that there is, for instance, power balance to begin with, right? For instance, when there is a power balance at their side of the house, oftentimes there are other incentives for you to actually sacrifice. For instance, it makes economically good sense, for instance, when you share food with your brothers, etc., it helps you to build better relationship. It helps you to form a better family environment to begin with. It also, for instance, required by the law, for instance, to give the basic needs of their children to begin with, right? But secondly, I think that oftentimes this uniquely happens in a scenario that CG depicts to you. For instance, when there is power imbalance, where it's not the context of the OG, when there's imbalance entrenches in the way that you have no space for the morality to step in, right? It more looks like, for instance, a relationship between parents and children. It more looks like, for instance, how you're going to push certain kind of accountability on schools, on the kind of charity that we depict to you at the end of the day, right? So that's the reason why we think our extension uniquely stands in. So I'm going to firstly respond to the closing opposition. Next, talk about why we actually outweigh the opening opposition, and then talk about how we actually outbeat the opening government. So firstly, on the closing opposition, I already talked to you that the reason why we think CEO loses is they base their context solely in a scenario that have so many alternatives for their impact to begin with, right? For instance, it makes totally economic sense for you to actually make that sacrifice, etc., right? And also, for instance, they say that, for instance, when you make that sacrifices, you don't actually expect others to repay you back, right? One, we don't think that's necessarily good, but secondly, we think that when you are being morally good to others, you also do to some degree expect others to actually repay you pay you back, right? That's also how you behave yourself. For instance, when you see others doing good to you, you also expect, for instance, doing good to others, etc., right? This expectation is also going to happen in our side of the house, right? While we think that they don't actually deal with is the more concrete impact where there is a power imbalance, which we think that there are so many bad consequences that we talk to you. That's how we actually already outweigh the closing opposition, because they assume their context in a way that only applies to the power balance scenario to happen. Secondly, why do we think that we actually outbeat the opening opposition, right? Because we think that the only thing coming from the opening opposition is that, at least you're going to make them feel better. The first thing to note here is we think that the thing here is, number one, the impact at their side of house is not uniquely beneficial, right? That's to say that one, oftentimes you already have a kind of like defense mechanism when you feel like yourself in a kind of like weak position, when you feel like you're being oppressed to begin with, right? You already have certain kind of self-dealing mechanism for you to actually feel better. So which means that the additional layer in terms of how you feel better is probably not so important compared with the material benefit that CG already talked to you. But secondly, right, a lot of their kind of impact is based on very vague premises and mechanism to begin with, right? It looks like, for instance, you already it looks like, for instance, you're already in a position that, for instance, you have to make sacrifices, right? But we tell you that one, this kind of like the framing of what morality is and what sacrifice is oftentimes controlled by the majority to begin with. It looks like, for instance, the stories that are written in the textbook, or it oftentimes look like, for instance, the behavior that we think what are moral and moral or not, right? But secondly, oftentimes for an action to be moral itself, it needs to autonomous, right? Which means that all the kind of framing at their side of the house by the leader of opposition directly mean that when people perceive that action as not being autonomous, when they perceive that they're in a no position, for instance, to make other choices instead of just sacrificing, they're not likely to perceive that as a moral thing to begin with, right?
POI.
That's how, for instance, the majority going to frame you as being not so morally good to begin with. What's the point of opening opposition?
You and opening government have the same problem by using social structures and social welfares that come as a result of the narrative on opening opposition as defense for why vulnerable people will still be okay. We say that grassroots movements clamor and demand for social structures. How do you get that structurally on your side?
But we think that that's just going to happen at both sides of the house. When you have, for instance, movement, or we think that the structural changes can also happen at our side of the house. We have like alternative incentive for the rich people or for majority people to care about those things to begin with, right? What are these alternatives incentive, right? We already talked to you. For instance, the sympathy also still exists at both sides of the house. When at our side of the house, majority also feel the miserable life. Also feel like, for instance, it's a necessity to guarantee certain kind of basic need is kind of immoral. They should feel sympathetic towards it, etc. But secondly, oftentimes they have other incentive, for instance, the PR, etc. PR or like better reputation, etc. Right? But thirdly, I think that at our side house, we're not doing anything, right? We're probably still, for instance, to care about the consequences in terms of how you're going to help them, how you're going to have concrete impact that's going to be more concretely evaluated, right? But lastly, I want to respond here is there is no guarantee that you are actually recognizing their sacrifices, right? This look like, for instance, you're probably not going to they're probably not going to feel like you're making enough sacrifice to begin with, right? You should not ask for something that is beyond your capacity or beyond the kind of like moral standard that you already have, right? For instance, a lot of time it's hard for the soldiers to ask for higher compensation, etc. Exactly because when the whole society expect them to have like high morality, oftentimes exactly the reason, for instance, they're not able to actually ask for certain kind of compensation because they're already being perceived as morally, for instance, salient, etc. It's hard for them to actually being selfish and ask for, which means that all your hope is counting on the majority, on the powerful. Lastly, on the opening government, right? Sorry. Number one, we think that a lot of their cases is quite symmetric, which means that Ricky already gave you the smart framing in terms of how the coercion can happen anyways, right? When they're talking about the coercive infrastructure, like in terms of conscription, that's probably going to happen anyway, and states are probably going to justify the legitimacy through laws, through a lot of things, etc., right? But secondly, I think that oftentimes their impact is quite vague, because if you want to believe their impact to stand, oftentimes you need to believe that the comparative at their side house. But I think that the comparative at the OG is quite vague in a way that they have a huge amount of burden to prove that huge impact, right? Because if they want to believe that there's going to be less oppression on minorities, they have to believe that this emphasis itself is going to change the whole structure. This emphasis itself is going to change the whole oppression. Oftentimes, the margin is quite low when you only consider about morality to begin with, right? Morality only happens in a quite private scenario where you're oftentimes shaped by how the people around you, when parents told you that you should be moral to begin with. That's how CG's unique extension in terms of how the children is probably going to have like more autonomy, how they're going to lead to less oppression, how, for instance, they're going to lead to more scrutiny over better relationship comes in, right? Based on all of these, I think that Ricky gave you the most concrete and most realistic scenario that morality happens, and that thus CG should take this debate.
Thank you, Government Whip. I invite Opposition Whip to conclude the debate.
starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Note that this is a retrospective debate, right? Which means when we tell you that the way that humans began to think about love and care came intertwined with the idea of sacrifice, and that's affected how people interacted and cared and protected each other over the ages, that becomes the most important impact in the debate, right? All right. So let's just quickly explain the only thing that CG responds to us on, right? That you do good things for other reasons as well, like economic incentives because you want to seem good and so on, right? Firstly, let's just take out things like the need to look good or moral superiority out of this debate. You don't care about feeling good or looking good more than you care about the immediate material benefits you can get if you don't sacrifice something. They then tell you that it makes economic sense to do things like cooperate with others, right? The problem with that is the people who are strong or the people who have power, it makes no economic sense for them to cooperate with others because they don't need anything in return from somebody else, right? So the principle of reciprocity doesn't really work here. The person who can hunt and get food doesn't need anything in return from someone else. He's perfectly capable of surviving by himself. So the people who the notion of sacrifice really benefits are the people who need things from others, are the people who are weak, are people who cannot get things for themselves, right? But also secondly, even if we believe in the idea of reciprocity, right? The degree to which reciprocity can make you do something is low, because reciprocity means that you need to have trust that someone will give you a return. That return is uncertain. The amount of which you will get that return is uncertain, and that return is also far away in the future. There's no reason you would do good things simply because of that, right? Which means the degree to the delta in this debate comes in that as a parent you will probably still take care of your child to some degree, right? But the difference that happens when you think sacrifice is important is that you're willing to give up a job in a high-paying job so that you can stay in a city where your child has a good school. The difference is that as a child, maybe you'll take care of your parent when they grow old. But the degree as a child, you'll maybe send money to your parent. But when you're willing to sacrifice for them, you will probably be willing to stay with them, as thousands of people have done over the years, stayed in the same house with their parents, take care of them, give them respect and all of those things because you think it's good for you to sacrifice on their behalf, right? And then finally, right? Apart from just economic, because you will not sacrifice when it makes economic sense for you not to sacrifice, we think that the notion of love and care and the willingness to do things for others only comes through sacrifice. Right, what is the impact on this, right? Firstly, the impact is not just you protecting, the impact is when love and care comes intertwined with sacrifice. You might be able to extend some degree of love and care to your own family, to the people who are most proximate to you. But for you to be able to extend this idea of giving up something that might be good for you for the benefit of others to people beyond your immediate circle, that requires the concept of sacrifice, right? That requires the concept of you being willing to give up things to people you never seen, never heard of, and for the formation of society in general. Right. Before I go into that, right? Opening up.
So, no matter what context, the narrative of sacrifice exacerbates and multiplies unnecessary pain on the self and on others because the cost is boundless. Why should you justify the ends and actions of the few for others?
Right, pretty simple. Firstly, collective decisions are what determine what sacrifices are good or bad, right? Which means the majority interest. The majority is poor, which means the majority says that giving up wealth is the good thing, is what sacrifice should be, is what the good of sacrifice should be, right? Which means that because the majority control the narrative of sacrifice, the narrative of what is good to be sacrificed, means they're the people who actually benefit from it, the people who are weak, right? But also secondly, right, why do we care even if there are some individuals who are harmed, the mothers, the minorities who they're talking about? Why do we care about society as a whole more than the individual, right? Firstly, because if life or the quality of life or the ability to make choices is what government bench as such says is good, right? The ability to do these things without coercion. Two things to note here. Firstly, more people living because, say, a war was fought that stopped the Nazis, because people are willing to make that sacrifice, know that humanitarian incentive is not enough to do this, right? We are not willing to go and give up your own life to save somebody else. That requires the idea of sacrifice, right? If more people are able to access this life, if more people are able to access this choice as a result of one person giving this up, one person being coerced into giving up their own life, that means that's just the scale of impact that you can create means that sacrifice is worth it, right? But also secondly, even if there are some people who get worse things as a result of sacrifice, even if, say, there's a woman who's coerced because of patriarchy into sacrificing something, know that all of these people get returns on the basis as well, because there is someone who is willing to sacrifice, say, their income so that so that she can also get food. There was a parent who was willing to sacrifice their time to take care of that person when she was sad, to give benefits to a person you would not have given if you were not willing to
You're
sacrifice. So note that even if some people are hurt by the fact that they have to sacrifice for others, most people are benefited more than they are hurt, because sacrifice is usually done from people who are strong and people who have power, because they have more to sacrifice. But also, the sacrifice coming from people who are strong and people who have power is exclusive to our side, because the people who are forced to sacrifice are people who are usually weak, and these people are made to do that for other reasons anyways. But the people who are have power and are willing to sacrifice only do it when the norm of sacrifice as a
You're
moral
right.
value good is emphasized, which only happens in our side. Right. All right. So what is OO missing here, right? It's unclear if people in OO opt into the same trade-offs to the same extent, right? Because they don't explain whether oppression will become less or more, because based on whether people are willing to fight, the idea of sacrifice if they don't think it's good, right? We explained to you, even if you're giving up sacrifices, you get things in return. But also, secondly, there's no value for respect in and of itself, even if you continue to live in oppression, and that's what opening Gov tries to do. But we explained to you the kind of benefits that you get, right? Right. So finally, right, because the counterfactual is a world where your value is based on social utility, right? And we explained to you why this is likely, because humans value utilitarian metrics in the absence of some overriding moral good that tells them sacrifice is good, right? Which means that people who were weak, people who were not strong, people who did not have access to things that could make sure they were the person who contributed most to society, they were not given value in society, right? That's what changes on our side. But also finally, right, just note that when the idea of love and care became intertwined with sacrifice, it meant that societies were able to form a lot better. It meant that your interactions within your family, that extra bit of interaction that could help a person or harm a person, that delta only came about with the notion of sacrificing something that's good for you, that could benefit another person more, right? That is a unique thing that sacrifice has, the notion of sacrifice has the ability to change and has changed in our world.
Thank you to all four teams for that debate. Thank you to the opposition whip.